wrong text because I like deleted it and then did something. It's hard to explain, but that's the text right there, the thing in there. That's it. So, all right, Romans chapter 3. Okay. Yeah. Ta-da! So let's do a little review. So last week we finished off the second chapter of Romans. Really cool. And the first two chapters of Romans are kind of different flavored. The first chapter is very Gentile in origin. It talks about how the Gentiles have had very little to do with God, and they went about and just kind of pursued whatever they wanted to do. And then in chapter 2, we talk about the Jews, who were God's chosen people, but ultimately weren't behaving exactly like God wanted them to act as His chosen people. And particularly last week, we talked about circumcision.
Wash joined your channel.
And how it relates to Jewish identity. And in regards to this idea of circumcision, we isolated two verses that really kind of brought out the full force of this Jewish misconception about circumcision. Anybody remember what those two verses were? That's one. Aw, sorry, Wash. I hope a baby feel better. Yes, Kessa has them both, verses 24 and 29. Talked about how the effect that the Jewish people and they're not following God had on the Gentiles was very visible, and that the Gentiles blasphemed God. And then in verse 29, it talked about how the circumcision isn't just this idea of a physical act, but it's a representation of what is within the heart. A Jew is a Jew on inwardly. Awesome. So the Jews were meant to be an example and a beacon to the Gentiles. But they failed in their obligation ultimately, and as a result, the Gentiles ended up with this very distorted view of God. So Paul introduces the idea of the true nature of circumcision. That's what verse 29 is back in chapter 2. And when you consider it, if you kind of look at it in the light of kind of mold it a little bit, it should be a concept that's very familiar to us here as Christians in the age of grace. This outward act that is merely evidence of an inward attitude. Any of you guys know where I'm going with this? Yes, Kessa. Sorry, Dodge. I didn't see your light until after Kessa answered. But yes, baptism.
That's okay, I forgive you.
Okay, I appreciate that. Feel better. So, having said all that, let's dive right into chapter 3. Can I get someone to read the first 4 verses? Doctor, on the orange light. I barely finished talking and he had it lit up. All right, go ahead, sir.
And what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. What if someone unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, and through everyone were a liar, as is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged.
Thank you. Okay, so simple question. Let's just start off nice and easy. What is the first word in verse 1? Yes, then. You will be hard-pressed to find a simple word in the English language. Then, it is 4 letters, 1 syllable. Real simple word. But if you hadn't... Don't you even, Shada. Don't you even. If you haven't noticed it yet, you're going to see a whole lot of this word and a bunch of other words very, very similar to it at the beginning of each of our studies in Romans. If you look through the book of Romans, just start back in chapter 1 and move along at the beginning of each section, especially in the ESV where it gives these nice little headings on each subsection within the chapters. Kind of breaks up the ideas. Depends on what version you're reading, Dodge. But if you look there, there are typically going to be one of four versions, or typically one of four words that's going to appear somewhere in the opening few words of each section. These words are going to be then, for, but, and therefore. You're usually going to find one of those. Now, what do all of those words have in common? Building upon, yes. Dodge.
We should look at what this commentary is commentating on.
What?
The Bible's the greatest commentary on itself. It's getting at that. Because this comes after something. Like Dr. was saying, it builds upon.
Okay.
So we should go after and pay attention to what that is, what the context is.
Yes, you guys are basically saying what I'm wanting. They're all conjunctions. I'm sorry, I'm diving into English language, but this is really important because conjunctions are words that connect or conjoin two different statements or ideas. And these words appear so frequently in Romans because the book of Romans is constantly building upon the ideas that it previously presented. Romans is often described much in the way that you would describe a legal treatise on the gospel because of the terminology that's used in it, but also because of its strict logical progression. And all that to say that as we continue on, it's vital that we remember what was already said, remember what came before, because if we don't, then what comes next isn't going to make any sense. It builds upon itself. Okay. Oh, guess I see your orange light.
What was that word? Treatise?
Treatise?
Something like that. It started with a T.
That word?
Oh, treatise. Okay, gotcha.
So you know what? Let's start an experiment. I might do this myself unless I could get a volunteer. Anybody want to be a volunteer? And this is not a 1 week volunteer. This is like a volunteer for the rest of the book of Romans, okay? So if that affects you in any way. All right. I have no idea who lit up first, but I'm going to go with
Doctor
Dodge
did.
because... Oh, okay.
He was right before me, unfortunately.
Okay. Doctor, I will offer this to... A volunteer's tribute.
Yep.
Doctor, do me a favor. I want you to start a running tally for us. Every time we come across one of those four words, then, for, but, and therefore, throughout the rest of the Romans, I want you to mark it down. Every time. Just because this is exactly what Romans does. It starts you in one place and says, okay, once you've got this, then we move on to this. Once you've got this, we move on to this. And then we move on next. Okay, and those are the four words. Yes, it warms my heart to know that you actually went and looked that up. Well, to be honest, Doc, it would probably be best if it was used at the beginning of sections or at like the beginning of a paragraph or beginning of a verse, because oftentimes those words will appear in the middle of sentences. I mean, they're conjunctions, so it's not unheard of for them to be there. Whenever I'm doing a study, I'll try to make particular note of when they happen. But it's not entirely outside of reason to think that I'm going to miss some. So if you have a question about one, feel free to ask. Okay. So after dissecting the idea of circumcision on the last verse of chapter 2, Paul comes up and asks a very logical question to someone of the Jewish mind, this Jewish mindset. Well, what advantage does the Jew have? What is the point of circumcision if it's about the heart and not the body? And so Paul rather bluntly answers, well, plenty. So firstly, let's not forget that the Jews were God's chosen people. And as a result, they were the beneficiaries of the direct revelation and presence of God. We have pretty much the entire first 39 books of the Bible as a result of that. The Old Testament, the Jews, the Torah, and all of this stuff come down through the prophets and various other what we call mouthpieces for God, which forms this direct revelation from God. The first Testament, the Old Testament, and that's awesome. Remember, chapter 2 presented the idea that the Jews were meant to be God's beacon to the rest of the world. We talked about that in verses 17 through 24 of chapter 2. Circumcision was meant to be the mark of the Jew. Because, if we go back to a book that we studied a number of years ago in this very Bible study, back to 1 Samuel in chapter 16, verse 7, God tells us very eloquently that man looks on the outward appearance, but God sees the heart. And so man doesn't see the heart, man sees what's on the outside. And so circumcision was a physical act as a distinction between God's chosen people and the rest of the world. A good way to think about it is this. Jewish mindset was very focused on circumcision because that's what they saw it as giving them on their identity. It's like, I'm circumcised, I'm a son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of the circumcision. I'm circumcised, I'm a Jew. Circumcision was not the point. Circumcision was the pointer. It was an indicator that something was different about the Jew, and that something was his God. The Jewish access to God's oracles was meant to serve as a strengthening of this purpose. I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, Shada. Okay. We move on. But, that's a great intent that the Jews were supposed to be marked with the circumcision so that other people would look to them and say, hey, that guy, that's peculiar. Wonder why he did that. And then as he would investigate, he would find out, oh, it's because he is serving as, because he serves this God and God has set him apart. And so he's been circumcised so that other people will know that he serves this God. But ultimately we know that didn't quite happen. We're very aware of the Jewish failure to meet this purpose. Exactly, Kessa. But that raises another question. If some of the Jews were unfaithful in fulfilling this purpose, does that nullify God's promise of his faithfulness? And this leads to one of the more intriguing phrases in the Bible, if you're like me, because I've talked about this next phrase very quite a bit at length with certain members of my family and at Bible college and such. It's an amazing phrase. And it's not amazing because of what Paul says. It's amazing because of how we've interpreted into English. For instance, the ESV translates it. It says, the verse says, stop turning my page, my fan. Darn it. Does their faithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. That's the ESV. But if you look over at the KJV, it translated a different way. It says, God forbid. Then you move over to the NIV, and the NIV says, not at all. Then you move over to the New Living Translation, and it says, of course not. And if you look at another one of my favorites, the American Standard, it says, may it never be. So what in the world, why are these translations literally all over the map with how they interpret this? Well, there are two things to understand. The first is that there are generally two rules of thought when it comes to the way you translate the Bible. There's a very literal translation, and there's what's known as a dynamic equivalent. Dynamic equivalent, it's to maintain the spirit of what's written, namely in trying to translate it into idioms that we would understand, trying to keep the force, oftentimes the force or the intensity or something along those lines of what's written, even if it's not as literal. Whereas with a more literal translation, it literally takes it and is like, this is what it says, and so that's what we're going to write here, even if it doesn't seem as forceful in the English language. So the actual phrase here is me ginomai, or me ginomai. I didn't actually look to see where the accent is. So, but that's the phrase right there. And literally in the Greek, it means may it never come to pass. So I'm going to give the NASB, the New American Standard, the +1 on that one for being closest in literal translation. But the key word is not in the ginomai there, but it's in the may. The may is essentially the word for never. And never is, that's a word that we can throw around the English language. It doesn't really strike us as anything amazing, but in the Greek, it was incredibly forceful. Essentially, it places the idea of removing even the possibility of something happening. It treats it as completely unthinkable. When I was researching it, I went to I went over to Bible Hub when I was doing research, and I like that they have a commentary, or not a commentary, well, they do have a commentary, but they have their Strong's Concordance, but their Strong's Concordance actually has a little bit of more expounding on the word than my concordance does. And so it translates it this way. It says that it negates the underlying idea or concept of a statement, ruling out its possibilities, or in essence, all that it suggests on a conceptual or hypothetical plane. So in essence, Paul is responding to this question about God's faithfulness by saying, no, never. I don't even want to consider that. I just don't even think about that. Don't think like that. Just get it out. Do you realize what that would mean if that were true? Essentially, think about it like it's the most emphatic no that you've ever heard. Tessa, your light is orange.
Can you repeat that quote?
The one from Bible Hub, I can actually do you one better, and I'll just put it straight in the chat.
Perfect, thank you.
Bam! Copyright. Yay. And to reassure his readers, Paul offers a quote from the Old Testament at the end of verse 4. Now, if you guys have already looked, fine. But if you haven't looked, then don't look. Does anybody know where this verse is found? That you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. Anybody know where that's from? Oh my gosh, Unger is here. Kessa.
It's Psalm 51, isn't it?
Psalm 51, yes ma'am. Now, that's all great, but is there anything particularly of note about Psalm 51? Anything special? That anything we can tie to that? Psalm of penance. Okay. Care to get a little more specific about that? Penance from what? Confession of sin. Okay. You're right. I'm just trying to see if we can pull it out. It's a very famous psalm because of the incident that it's tied to. Yes, this is the psalm that David writes after being confronted by the prophet Nathan after he's committed adultery with Bathsheba. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Paul draws from Psalm 51 to back up his idea here. Because what is Paul discussing in this verse? He's talking about God's faithfulness.
I am Robzer left your channel.
And in Psalm 51, what's the context? It's a plea for God's faithfulness to an unfaithful man. And of course, in keeping with context, we're still addressing the Jewish mind. Bringing up this verse is automatically going to trigger in a Jewish mind. They know the Psalms. The Psalms are like a hymn book to the Jew. And so bringing this up and utilizing it this way, this is automatically going to connect with the Jewish mindset. Also, on a side note, did you realize that there are actually 2 verses referenced in verse 4? 2 different verses. It's really easy for us to notice the end of verse 4 because it's in the ESV, it's indented and it's got that little fancy print on it and all that stuff. So it's like, oh yeah, it's that one definitely. But there's another one because it says, "Let God be true, though everyone were a liar." That is actually a Septuagint translation of Psalm 116, verse 11. Like, what's the Septuagint? You guys remember? We've talked about this a few times. You guys remember what the Septuagint is? It is very Greek. Matter of fact, it's all Greek. It's actually the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Yeah. Psalm 116:11 says, "I said in my alarm, all mankind are liars." That's the original from the Hebrew. The Septuagint translates it as, "Let God be true, though everyone were a liar." Not necessarily the first part, but "though everyone were a liar" is a direct reference back there. Okay? That's just a fun little one. Just drop that in there. But again, referencing the psalm again would also trigger that Jewish mindset. Now, Paul has seemingly addressed the idea of God's faithfulness remaining intact in spite of man's failings, particularly Jewish failings. But that idea brings up an entirely new question. If my sin, if the sin of the Jews or my sin or whoever's sin only further reveals the righteousness and the glory of God, If my unrighteousness reveals God's righteousness, why am I held accountable for it? If it's just showing me who God is more and more, why should I be held accountable for it? I mean, isn't that helping reveal God's character? And Paul then goes to address that in verses 5 through 8. Well, can I get someone to read those verses? There's Dodge's light. Dodge, go ahead, sir.
But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means, for then how could God judge the world? But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil that good may come, as some people slanderously charge us with saying? Their condemnation is just.
Thank you, sir. Yes, doctor, you do count that one. All right. So in verse 5, we see this question reiterated. What gives? If my sin shows God's righteousness, then I don't see how he gets off for judging me for it. So I'll open this one up. Anybody want to take a stab at the problem with this argument here? Dada, your light's orange, ma'am.
Just because it's showing God's righteousness does not negate the fact that the person is wrong or unrighteous in this case.
Okay. Any other thoughts? All right. Yeah. Essentially, the claim is that God is unjust by judging actions that ultimately only bring him glory. The problem with this argument here is that they fail to consider one of God's most often overlooked attributes, his holiness. They considered it unfair that their own sinful actions, which did reveal the truth of God, should be punished. But that's just a classic case of trying to make the ends justify the means. And this is an echo back to chapter 2 as well. It's not about the outside, what the hands do, what the actions are, but it's about the heart. And what's on the inside eventually makes its way to the outside. And God's holiness demands our holiness. I don't want you guys to miss that because that's really important. God's holiness demands our holiness. That's important. We're not going to have the opportunity to fulfill that or to bring that full circle this study, but we will get to that. Okay? Just hang on to that one. And so Paul, he's just trying to reassure the Roman church at this point. He puts in this little aside, in this little parentheses, he says, hey, guys, don't panic. This is me talking like I would if I was seeing this from a human perspective. Don't worry. God taught me better than this. So no worries. We're good. This is hypothetical, okay? Don't panic. I haven't gone off my rocker completely. And so after the question in verse 5, we come back to a very familiar phrase at the beginning of verse 6. There it is, meginomai. And Paul's response is exactly what we covered. If God wasn't holy and righteous, how could he judge the whole world like we know he will? Then Paul decides to shift back to that human way of thinking that he just mentioned, that little parenthetical right there, as he poses two more rhetorical questions that technically both were covered back in verse 6. If through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil that good might come? But this time, Paul shifts his focus slightly from the idea that spawns these questions to the people that propagate these questions. More than likely, the people that were bringing up these questions or saying these things were probably Jews, or some of the more infuriated Jews, like the Pharisees and such, that were very against this idea of Christianity and the teachings of Jesus. They were out and they trying to twist and misrepresent the Christian teaching on grace, and they tried to turn it into something more along the lines of license to do anything you want. License to do anything you want. That kind of sounds familiar. Anybody think that we've covered anything like that before? Yeah. Seems to me that we've talked about this back in the little book of Jude a short while ago. Yep. What in particular, Shada? You retracting your statement? Okay. Fan's turning her page. No. I have that same problem. Now, Paul doesn't quite address these questions here, but that's going back to the conjunctions that we talked about, the whole reason that Doc's got this spreadsheet rolling. We haven't gotten there yet. Paul needs to build a little bit more of a foundation. He needs to, that's a few levels up, and we haven't quite built up to that level yet. So we're going to build a little bit more before we're ready to tackle these
joined your
questions head on.
channel.
Don't worry, we will get there in a few chapters. All right. So what? In many ways serves as a segue into the next major portion. But it also establishes an important concept within our minds. It's the independence of God's righteousness from the deeds of men. God is completely, 100%, totally holy and just. And I got news for you, there's not a thing we can do about it. Nothing. And that probably shouldn't come as a surprise to most of us. That's not like G-Scribe, that's revolutionary. Had no idea about that one. Thanks for that little mental nuke going off there. I understand that. It becomes absolutely transformational and revolutionary when you combine it with what we read in the next 2 weeks here in chapter 3. So this is key. God is holy. If you want to take anything out of this passage, anything out of these 8 verses, it's that God is completely holy and there's nothing that mankind can do about that. And Shada's catching on. And we spent over a month in the book of Romans. We've been in Romans for over a month, guys. And so far, we've yet to really see any speck of this alleged and mythical good news. It's like, I know it's here, but I haven't seen it yet. Well, prepare for that all to change. Romans 3 is the pivot point for the gospel in the book of Romans. Because in chapter 3, the only possible thing, the only conceivable thing that could make this story good in any way finally happens. God intervenes. In a few verses. We're not quite there yet. Hashtag cliffhanger. So what do you guys think? You guys have any thoughts? What do you guys think about this passage? Just a short one, just 8 verses. Still got it done on time. Yes. Ongarth, I only took 8 verses. You took like half a chapter last week, man. No questions? No thoughts? No controversy? I didn't even manage to get a controversy out this week. Holy cow. Am I slipping?
Yo, I have a question.
Oh, there we go. Thank goodness.
So verse 6, verse
Yes.
7. There's a 4 and a button there. Do I count those?
Oh man. Yes, you count the 4 in verse 6. Yeah, you count both of those. Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And I had to explain that to Ongarth. Ongarth, we are doing we have a conjunction counter running in Romans. Whenever we come across any of the 4 words, what do we say? For, then,
Therefore,
but, and
but.
therefore. Whenever we come across one of those 4 words, Doc has to press the button on his counter so that we keep those rolling. Because we're learning how the book of Romans builds upon itself. Dodge, your orange light.
I have a question on that. So
Okay.
is that then just when it is the first word of the sentence?
Ideally, because that shows a progression in thought.
Got it. What if it's the not the first word of the sentence, but it's the first word of the verse?
The idea, Ongarth. I'm sorry?
What if it's not the first word of the sentence, but it's the first word of the verse?
Can you give me an example? I know what you're saying, but I haven't seen that particularly.
Let's see here.
Because you got an example that I can.
I can look through the entirety of Romans if you want.
Don't.
I already started.
You will be at
that.
it a while.
Hold on. Well, I guess as an example, that doesn't have this specifically, but has it with and. On verse 12 of Romans 4, it starts off with and. It's in the middle of a sentence.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly there's cases like that with 4 as well.
I guess that a good example for you would be verse 8 of chapter 2, where it starts with the word but that's the first word of the verse, but not of the sentence.
Also, are we counting them for chapters 2 and 1 as well?
That's what I was wondering.
Nope.
Okay.
No, we're just starting with chapter 3.
So
I
with
didn't
that
want,
one,
I didn't want to make it. If you want to do it on your own time, have at. Go have fun.
would we count that but?
Say what?
Would we count that but? For verse 8 of chapter 2, if it was not in chapter 2.
No, you wouldn't count that one.
Okay. Cool.
Now, the one in verse 5, you would count that, but not the one in verse 8. 8 is a continuing thought. 5 starts a little bit of a different one. Verse 8 of chapter 2 or 3. I'm sorry, Kickster. We kind of been jumping around between chapters. Okay. All right, chapter 3. Darn it, fan. And why not do evil that good may come? As some people slanderously charge us with saying, their condemnation is just. What Paul's addressing here is there were some people that were making this statement and charging Paul and other church leaders with saying that, hey, you guys can go out and do bad things because God's still going to get the glory from it. You can do whatever you want. And they were basically turning the teaching of grace into license to do whatever the heck they wanted. and they were trying to say that this is what Paul and a number of other church leaders were teaching, when it wasn't. It was just slander to try to make them bad. No, Paul doesn't say that. These people that were trying to undermine Paul were saying that. Yes, that's true. Yes. God's condemnation of them is just. Correct. Thank you, Shada, for clarifying, because I have no idea what's being asked. Anything else, guys? Yes, exactly. Paul doesn't give it a lot of attention because he plans to come back to it. He's not done with this. He definitely touches on this subject later in Romans. It's like he takes it here and he says, I'm not ready to deal with this yet. I'm going to hold it here in my hand. I'm going to teach you for about 2 or 3 chapters, and then we're going to bring this back, and then I'm going to hit it, okay? So he says, look, this is garbage. This is absolute rubbish. Don't listen to this. This is just absolute poppycock, horse hockey. I want you guys to know that, but I'm not gonna deal with it in full disclosure just yet. We'll get to that. Again, Kickster, that is tied to the next statement. These are the questions that are being asked by these, that are being posed by these people that are trying to slander Paul. It's a rhetorical question. Paul really isn't saying that. It's other people that are saying that, trying to discredit him. All right. Anything else? Last call. You're welcome, Kickster. Welcome to Romans. But you know, Ongarth didn't give us any good news in chapter 2. And I didn't give us a lot of good news in chapter 1. We're finally getting around to it, guys. So hang in there a little bit longer. Good news is on its way. Henceforth cometh the gospel. All right. Any prayer requests before we close out? Oh, yep, that's right. Thank you, Kessa. Yay! Doctor, I